Good morning. This is day 94 of 100 Days of Visibility. My intention is to keep today's session particularly short. So I have a Stoa session, a third of three, that I'm giving at the top of the hour. So I'll see what I can hold here. And part of this is just doing these helps to center me first thing in the morning as well. So I've been continuing to read a book, Introduction to Tantra by Lama Yeshe. No idea how to pronounce that, but that's my attempt to pronounce a Tibetan name. This is Buddhist Tantra. And this is about an enlightenment practice, which is faintly related to, but dramatically different from the thing that often gets called Tantra in particularly North America. There's a piece that I found very touching. I keep finding pieces that are very touching in this work. And this one was about something that Lama Yeshe referred to as guru yoga. I'm putting together a presentation in my head. I'm just sorting this out. Give me a moment. Let me see if I can just cut to the core. I notice how my mind reflects parts of my experience in something like its basic operating system. Something like, what are the assumptions it makes about what's real? When I hand it a task, what does it do with the task? What does it assume is real? And what kinds of objects does it work with in order to produce answers for me? The proper term for this is, what ontology is it running? Like this is in the same contrast as, I'm going into a little too much detail there. There's a very concrete thing this means. Like, am I thinking about rocks? Am I thinking about people? Am I thinking about relationships? Am I thinking about energy? Am I thinking about consciousness? So if you're operating in the habit of your mind reflecting the physical world, so you think, well, the objects that are real are the physical things. If that's the way that you work, and you think of, well, something like government is actually a derived entity, but like people are real. If that seems obviously true to you, then then probably the easiest way for your mind to track what I'm talking about is to assume that I'm talking about what amounts to layers of abstraction. Like, can my mind think about government the way that a 3-year-old's mind can't? It's not that a 3-year-old is stupid. It's that they have a particular kind of lack of familiarity with a way of thinking, with a way of viewing the world. Often 3-year-olds have no idea what a relationship is. They're certainly affected by them. They certainly interact with people, and that interaction forms a kind of structure. But the 3-year-old basically can't see the structure. They're reacting to it. In the same kind of way, a lot of people know the word government, and they have a place in their mind for a concept of government, but they sort of expect the government to do things like a conscious entity that they can negotiate with in ways that don't make sense for what government actually is. I'm just using government as one example. I could use any group as a relatively clear instance of the thing I'm talking about. So the level of abstraction, on the inside it feels terribly weird to talk about it that way. I'm tracking, well, what is it that I've had a number of experiences of feeling like there's a kind of intelligence in the background that sort of shapes my my experience and my encounters with the world. I'm pausing and reflecting, going, I'm about a third of the way through the time that I had wanted to allot to this. So can I be even more efficient and still be true to the energy? And there's a lot of beautiful stuff to share here. And maybe giving myself about 15 minutes is too little for this. I'll have other opportunities though. I'm feeling into the compression there. Yeah, let's try another cut. I am aware of a kind of purity that is always untouched, behind, above, and surrounding all of my thoughts and my contractions. The more I focus on that, the more clearly my mind reflects that purity. And the more my identity structures, which are all mental, it's a mental system, the more those reshape to reflect that purity, the more I come to identify as the purity. And what is that purity? Well, it's enormously self-evident. It's enormously self-evident. It's when I pause and I just see the beauty of what surrounds me. What sees the beauty? What feels the beauty? What is it that can answer that like a koan? Instead of trying to say, oh, well, here's the theory, blah, 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 can instead dive down into the experience. Who or what dives? I am able to direct my attention so that I'm paying attention to my feet, so I'm paying attention to the air. Who? Who is doing this directing? There's this pristine clarity that is the answer. There's probably the most dramatic moment of a spiritual experience I've had. Actually, I don't know if that's true anymore. Some of the ones I had in Mexico actually may have trumped it, but one of the most dramatically powerful spiritual experiences I've had was being in a kind of meditative space with a friend and then watching my mind shatter and sort of fall onto the ground, and I couldn't work with it. It wouldn't respond. I would call on it and it would just fall apart again, and I would pull together the pieces and it would fall apart again. I had this sensation like it was falling on the floor. And then he grabbed my attention and said, great, so now that you can't use your mind, because he was tracking the fact that I was addicted to using my mind for everything. And to a large extent, I still am, much less so. He said, well, now that you can't use your mind, now. But that moment's past, here is now. Ah, but that moment's gone too, and here's another now. And now. And here it is again. And here it is again. And that, there's a lot of detail to what happened for me there. There's a kind of opening up, a sort of piercing into infinity, and recognizing that in part because my mind was shattered, I would not be able to hold all of what I was seeing. Also, the mind is so thin compared to all of that. Looking into infinity is, it's big. But what I took back, I could tell I could take back one piece, or just a few pieces. And one of them was this memory. I remember the experience of piercing into the infinity. And part of what came through, part of what returned, was a remembrance that there is this contrast between the self that talks, that moves this body, that thinks it is the body, that sort of mechanically runs around, and me. We had our own lingo based on an old role-playing game, Mage the Ascension, where your higher self gets referred to as the avatar. So the first thing I found myself saying, it took a couple of minutes because I was really concerned about articulating, shattering my grounding in the experience. And there's something true about that, because articulation goes through the mind, and what I was seeing was beyond the mind. And what I finally found myself saying that felt like it could ring and help to anchor the experience is, I am the avatar. There's a very, in reading this Tantra book, there's so many caveats about it. You need to be careful that you're not, like there's this whole initiation process, there's all these nuances, but there's something very simple at the core, and I think I know what he's talking about. There's a problem where a mind that is fixated, particularly on the physical level, like a mind that does not register, like, I mean, this is the status of our whole civilization right now. So fixated on the physical, it's so fixated on the mechanical and cannot see. And so we try to talk about all of this subtle stuff, kind of, sort of, but mostly gets swept up in its waves. This is what the culture wars are. The culture wars are getting swept up in. It's like being a 3-year-old in relationship to relationships. 3-year-olds are totally affected by relationships, but they have no idea what's going on, and they end up getting buffered around and controlled in ways that they cannot see. If there were only 3-year-olds, there would be an interesting problem. There wouldn't be any clarity about what's going on that could be articulated. If somebody gets relationship, oh, we're being controlled by relationships, this becomes enormously clear that it's true and enormously hard to communicate, because 3-year-olds are running around anchored in something completely different, like things, literal things. Do I get the ice cream? Do I have my blanket? The question of, is the feel of our interaction the kind that cultivates a sort of spirit of the style that we want? Or even if you simplify it, do I feel mommy nearby? Like, the fixation is on mommy, the fixation is not on the closeness. And so that's a layer of abstraction too subtle for most 3-year-olds. And that's the world that we find ourselves in. Not particularly to relationships, but we talk about the culture wars. What is a culture? We're not even talking necessarily about cultures. It's just the term that we have. I recently had some online conversations, and I'm still to finish them up. I need to, I'm still working on cleaning out and holding my own energetic space in a way that lets me show up cleanly to clear out my space, and to clarify boundaries, and also to interact within those boundaries in ways that I find respectful. But there's this bit about, like, talking about cancel culture. Is there such a thing? Like, well, what do you mean by, is there such a thing? There's clearly a force. There's a subtle force. But calling it a culture is kind of weird. There is something there. And talking about whether what happened with the Dr. Seuss books was banning, as apparently a very hot topic because of the way that the word gets used. Like, okay, well, how do we talk about reality while staying true to the subtle layer? Oh, we can't because, I mean, some of us can. We can work with it. It requires subtlety. We have to be conscious of the subtle level. And this business about being the higher self, having the mind reflect the clarity that is beyond all of this, is even more subtle than the subtle level. It's getting the mind to reflect the diamond-like purity of being. It makes all of this even possible. It provides the context. That's where choice is. That's where perspective is. So just bringing the mind to light on that level of subtlety, I can notice the places where my mind, where it's still fixated on even the physical level. Parts of my mind are still very fixated on the physical level. I'm not trying to abandon that either. It's useful, like the same way that even though you know about relationships, as adults we can talk about relationships and we can relate to relationships. It's still really helpful to be able to see people and interact with people. But it's also important to be able to see through them and to recognize that there's something deeper going on. And that a lot of times a person, quote unquote, is actually sort of possessed by the influences of things that are more subtle. What's relevant is not the person, the relevant is them as a vector for subtle forces. So, yeah, I guess what I want to say there is there's something that I'm very alive to about right now I'm being torn. I'm letting myself be torn between two things. I'm trying to be, well, three things really. I'm trying to be clear for people who may not have a full experiential contact with the causal level, with the subtler than subtle level that I'm talking about. Although if you're watching my videos, if you're listening to what I have to say, the chances are extremely good that you have had a conscious mental reflection of the causal level at some point. Most people call that a spiritual awakening. Until, like, before the mind has any reflection on the causal level, you can't cause anything. You're only reacting and then telling stories. I'm reminded of a quote by Stephen Koss. You are not the king of your brain. You're the creepy guy standing next to him saying, "A most judicious choice, sire." Like that's the state of everyone who has not had the causal level reflect into the mind. Now, it's not a binary thing. It's like you can't not have the mind completely out of touch with the causal level. It's not possible. That doesn't make any sense. It's like having a planet that has nothing to do with space. You can have people on the planet who completely ignore everything beyond the atmosphere. That's doable. But it is literally ignorance. It is ignoring. So if you are choosing to show up for the things that I have to say, the chances are extremely good that your mind has had this glimmer, at the very least a glimmer, of this vast clarity. And you can still get that glimmer and then fixate on the objects. A lot of people will have a glimmer of the causal level and then port that glimmer through the subtle level into descriptions of Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior, or whatever paradigm you want to drag in. So, in some very deep and important sense, none of that matters. Even for the people who are, like, you show up and you go, "Wow, but this disagrees with my paradigm." Great, that's a fact about your mind. I'm just talking about the truth. And in particular, trying to name the truths about the causal level for minds that are fixated at the physical is going to tend to drift in a direction that it will give the illusion of understanding because the type of thing is so far outside of experience that it is hard to relate to. So I'm feeling some tension about, I want to nail this down. I want to be clear. But I also want to anchor this in myself as well by talking about it. So the talking happens through the mind. And as I talk more clearly about these things, the more clearly my mind reflects the causal level. There's so much space, even for orienting to all the tension and digestion. If you watch yesterday's video, you'll get a very clear sense of, oh, Michael can get really fucked up at the subtle level. Yeah, I went to the subtle gym, really, really worked out my subtle body, and it turns out that I can need a lot of recovery from that, but it doesn't affect me. It affects my ability to show up. That's all. Having the space to see that clearly removes a tremendous amount of the knotting that happens in the mind and at the subtle level about, what's wrong with me? Nothing. Nothing ever can be wrong. So I'm going to call this a rough draft. And 5 minutes over what I had aimed for, which is great because I gave myself a little more time than I had told myself. Yeah. I feel like the main thing I'm actually getting from this video session is the need to be careful with compression, time compression. I'm trying to squeeze things in. I've been learning that lesson for a while. So I'm going to call this a rough draft, take the lesson of compression, and call this here, and go on to my Stoa session in 5 minutes. Thanks for listening.